City alone, there are more than 131,000 cases of COVID-19. That's an increase of nearly 10,000 since yesterday, and our city has suffered over 13,000 deaths. While we are waiting for the president, we'd like to try to answer some of your questions, so please type them in the comments. Again, if you're just joining us, I'm Alan Piper, and you're watching NowThis daily live fact check of the president's coronavirus briefings. Now, it may be hard to believe, but today marks 1 year since the Mueller report was released in redacted form. It contains some of the most shocking evidence ever compiled against a sitting U.S. president. It confirmed that Russia did indeed meddle in the 2016 election with the express purpose of helping elect Donald Trump, and that Trump and his campaign knowingly welcomed and sought out the help of a hostile foreign power to influence the U.S. election. The active collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia appears to have fallen short of criminal conspiracy, largely because the Trump campaign was too disorganized to better coordinate with the intelligence officers running Russia's covert pro-Trump operations. The report also uncovered at least 10 instances of potentially illegal obstruction of justice by the president, a pattern which foreshadowed the later obstruction of the Ukraine investigation, for which President Trump was ultimately impeached. Again, if you're just joining us, I am Alan Piper, and this is NowThis live fact check of President Trump's daily coronavirus briefings. While we are waiting for the president, we're going to try to answer your questions, so please start typing them in the comments. We have a question from Catherine. She'd like to know how many sailors on Captain Crozier's ship tested positive for COVID-19. And the answer is that 655 sailors had tested positive among over 4,500 who were examined. More than 14%, that is. One Roosevelt sailor with COVID-19 died on Tuesday, marking the first fatality in the active duty military during the pandemic. He was identified as Chief Petty Officer Charles Robert Thacker. He was 41 years old. 6 more sailors are hospitalized, including 1 in intensive care, according to the Navy. Thousands of others are quarantined in hotel rooms under guard. Captain Crozier was fired following a letter in which he urged Navy leaders to evacuate most of the sailors on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Top officials have not ruled out reinstating Crozier after an investigation into his handling of the situation. Again, if you're just joining us, I'm Alan Piper, and this is NowThis live fact check of President Trump's daily coronavirus briefings. We are expecting the president at any moment, and we're expecting this could be a fiery briefing. The president has been on a real tear this week. On Monday, he declared that as president, his authority is, quote, total, and suggested he could force governors to reopen states against their wills. For the record, this is false. This is clearly against the Constitution. On Tuesday, he announced that he's cutting off funds to the World Health Organization in the middle of a world health emergency. Democrats say that he cannot legally do this. On Wednesday, he threatened to adjourn Congress and govern the nation all on his own. On Thursday, he rolled out plans to reopen the states, even though governors and health experts say we're not doing nearly enough testing to be able to do this safely. And then on Friday, he unleashed a series of tweets that were widely seen as inciting violence in states with Democratic governors. He tweeted in all caps, "Liberate Minnesota," and an angry mob has been gathering outside the Democratic governor's home. He tweeted, "Liberate Michigan," fueling protests against Michigan's Democratic governor, whom he has repeatedly mocked and belittled. This week, Michigan protesters actually blocked an ambulance from entering a hospital. Perhaps most chilling of all, he tweeted, "Liberate Virginia and save your great Second Amendment. It is under siege." This tweet came the day after the 13th anniversary of the Virginia Tech shooting, which left 32 dead and 23 injured. In yesterday's briefing, he doubled down on that last tweet and its violent rhetoric, saying that Virginia's Governor Northam should be, quote, under siege. And in fact, a gun-toting angry mob really did gather outside the governor's home. Now, the president falsely claimed that Governor Northam is, quote, taking away guns in Virginia. I want to tell you what is actually in the law that the governor signed. So it's universal background checks, not a radical idea. 92% of Americans support this, including a majority of gun owners. He signed into effect a red flag law. Again, the majority of Americans support red flag laws. He implemented a limit on purchases so that you can't buy more than one handgun a month. This does not seem so radical. It's hard to imagine why law-abiding citizens would need to purchase multiple handguns at a time. You are not Deadpool. You don't need a whole duffel bag full of guns to legally protect your home or go hunting. He enacted a fine for parents who leave their guns out where their kids can get at them. And he enacted a requirement that if your gun is stolen, you have to tell the police. So it is hard to see how many of these restrictions could be considered radical, and they are definitely not overturning the Second Amendment or stripping law-abiding Virginians of their guns, as the president has suggested. So that's where we are today. If you are just joining us, I'm Alan Piper, and this is our live daily fact check of President Trump's coronavirus briefing. All of us at NowThis are self-isolating and working from home. I'm broadcasting from my apartment in the East Village, so please forgive any technical difficulties if my internet goes out for a moment or if I get Zoom bombed by one of my cats again. So we're expecting the president at any moment, and in the meantime, we're going to answer some of your questions, so please type them in the comments, and we will get right at them. Heidi asks, why is there no sign language interpreter during the briefings? That is a good question. Most governors and mayors have been having sign language interpreters during their briefings. President Trump has not been a big supporter of people with disabilities. He reportedly, in violation of the law, ordered Braille to be removed from the elevator of Trump Tower because he said no blind people would be living in the building. And now, here is President Trump. We will be fact-checking him in real time.
We continue to see a number of positive signs that the virus has passed its peak. It's been very devastating all over the world, 184 countries, probably more. This number was as
It is more. It's 185 countries.
Burks will walk through some of these trends in a few moments, but they're very positive trends for winning. We're going to win. We're going to close it out. While we mourn the tragic loss of life, and you can't mourn it any stronger than we're mourning it, the United States has produced dramatically better health outcomes than any other country, with a possible exception of Germany, and I think
this is simply not true. The U.S. has more cases than any other country and has experienced more deaths than any other country. The U.S. accounts for roughly 30% of all the world's cases and 20% of all the deaths.
Western Europe, with the lone exception of possibly Germany, this includes the UK, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, France. Spain, for example, has a mortality rate that is nearly 4 times that of the United States. But you don't hear that. You hear we have more death. But we're a much bigger country than any of those countries, by far. So when the fake news gets out there and they start talking about the United States as number one, but we're not number one, China's number one, just so you understand.
That is not true. That is simply not true. The U.S. has more cases and more deaths than any other country. Not only does the U.S. have more cases than any other country, the U.S. has more cases than the next 4 countries combined.
You'll have to explain that. Someday I'll explain it. Since we released the guidelines to open up America again, and this was 2 days ago, a number of states led by both Democrat and Republican governors, have announced concrete steps to begin a safe, gradual, and phased opening. Texas and Vermont will allow certain businesses to open on Monday while still requiring appropriate social distancing precautions. And I can tell you the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, he knows what he's doing. He's a great governor. He knows exactly what he's doing. Montana will begin lifting restrictions on Friday. Ohio, North Dakota, and Idaho have advised non-essential businesses to prepare for a phased opening starting May 1st. Throughout this crisis, my administration has taken unprecedented actions to rush economic relief to our citizens. As an example, you don't hear any more about ventilators. What happened to the ventilators? And now they're giving you the other. It's called testing. But they don't want to use all of the capacity that we've created. We have tremendous capacity. Dr. Birx will be explaining that. They know that. The governors know that. The Democrat governors know that. They're the ones that are complaining.
So the president is using this as an opportunity to take a dig at Democratic governors, and he's also using that little trope that Republicans do of referring to Democratic governors as Democrat governors. It's just a little microaggression. The fact of the matter is that he says that you don't hear a lot about ventilators. Governors are still in desperate need of ventilators. And he says that he's suggesting that the shortage of testing is a failure by the states, and this is also misleading and misrepresenting the situation.
Action is directly supporting 30 million American jobs. Amy Wright from North Carolina, as an example, said the program is a game changer for her and her family. It's coffee shops, and she has 120 employees, many of whom have developmental and intellectual disabilities. And now they're all staying, and they're getting paid, and she's got a dream, and it's going to take place very quickly when she opens again. So, Amy, good luck. North Carolina, great place. Scott and Julie Alderink help lead a church and own a restaurant in South Dakota with about 15 employees. They were already starting layoffs. Layoffs were moving along rapidly.
Now, the president is mentioning South Dakota. South Dakota is one of the states where there has been more limited efforts to try to control the spread of the disease, and as a result, it has been surging. There has been a 205% increase in South Dakota in the last week.
The Paycheck Protection Program funding is now fully drained. It's out. It's gone. $350 billion to small businesses, and in turn it goes to the employees of those small businesses. Lawmakers must stop blocking these funds and replenish the program without delay. The Democrats have to come on board. I used to read that these were Democrat programs, not Republican. Seems to have switched around a lot, hasn't it, huh?
Now, the president is somewhat misrepresenting the situation with the Paycheck Protection Act. He had requested an additional $250 billion for these small business loans. Democrats supported that extension, but insisted that it be paired with additional funds for hospitals. Hospitals are desperately overrun at the moment and need more support. Democrats insisted that there be more funding for hospitals, more funding for state and local governments, and funds aimed specifically at minority-owned and rural small businesses. Mitch McConnell and the Republicans opposed those additions and opted to instead let the funding run out for everything.
Community health center sites and mobile medical stations.
I am going to try to improve the sync here for you. I recognize that there is that this is out of sync, so excuse me while I work on that.
Incredible. These centers provide care to 28 million people living in medically underserved urban and rural regions. Health center sites and mobile medical stations. in order to equip them with the most advanced and robust testing capabilities. These sites are incredible. What they can do is incredible. The job they do is incredible. These centers provide care to 28 million people living in medically underserved urban and rural regions, including many African American and Hispanic communities. We're taking care of them. And it's so important because you've all been reading about the disproportionate numbers on African American, and you're reading a little bit less about Hispanic, but likewise Hispanic communities. The numbers are disproportionate. In fact, we're doing big studies on it right now. We don't like it. Not right. Nationwide, we've now conducted over 4 million tests, and Deborah will be talking about that. It's double the number conducted by any other country on earth. So that's more than 2 times, actually, the number.
This is false. According to the information we have, it is still under 4 million tests in the U.S., and it is about 3.6 million, so it isn't really almost 4 million. And in terms of testing per capita, we are far behind other nations. We are around number 42 in the world on testing. The president also was praising the Republican governor of Texas. He tends to praise Republican governors even if they are doing less well in containing the disease than Democratic governors. Texas has only conducted approximately 169,000 tests out of its population of 29 million. That is as of yesterday.
For instance, per capita testing is 6% higher than in Singapore. In fact, there's a typo. It's 67% higher. There's a big difference. I'd say there's a big difference between 6% and 60%. I was looking and said, 6% doesn't look too good. It's 67%. Good job out there. Higher than Singapore, 64% higher than South Korea, and 47% higher than Australia. So it's 67% higher than Singapore, which is a very advanced place in terms of what they're doing. My administration has also been speaking frequently with many of the governors to help them find and unlock the vast unused testing capacity that exists in their states. Dr. Birx discussed yesterday the commercial and academic laboratories in the states have tremendous unused capability, which they can use. The governor should use it. Tremendous unused capability. They're waiting for business from these governors that some of them complain. I must tell you, for the most part, we're getting along great with them, but some of them like to complain. But I still go back because the hardest thing of all, by far, by a factor of 20, is the ventilators. And now we're the king of ventilators. We have ventilators. We're going to be helping other countries very soon. We're going to be helping Mexico. I spoke with the president of Mexico. He's great, great guy. And I told him we're going to be helping him. They desperately in Mexico need ventilators. And I told him we're going to be helping him very substantially. We're in a position to do that. We're building now thousands a week. And they're coming in rapidly, and they're very, very high quality.
So these numbers that he was quoting in terms of our testing per capita versus other nations, these are false. Singapore is testing more people per capita than the U.S. The U.S. has tested only about 1% of the population. Tests peaked in the U.S. on April 4th, and we have since been doing fewer than 150,000 tests a day.
5 minutes, boom, you put it in. And we're making thousands of machines. Abbott is making thousands and thousands of machines, but not everybody's going to get that one, but they're going to get others. We have numerous platforms, which we'll talk about in a minute. Unfortunately, some partisan voices are attempting to politicize the issue of testing, which they shouldn't be doing, because I inherited broken junk, just as they did with ventilators.
he's saying that you shouldn't attempt to politicize it, and now he's making a baseless attack on President Obama. He said that he inherited worthless junk. That is not true. The fact of the matter is that he could not have inherited tests for COVID-19 from President Obama because COVID-19 is a new virus. There was no test for it before now. Germany, in January, before it had a single case, began trying to build tests. The U.S. could have begun putting its own tests together then and did not. And in terms of what the previous administration left behind, I want to quote former Obama security advisor Susan Rice, who was on CNN this week, saying, quote, when the Obama administration left office, we left the national strategic stockpile fully stocked, adequately prepared, but more than the stockpile, we left this incoming administration with all the tools that we had created for ourselves and that they needed to confront such a pandemic.
I know he said that we were projecting. We're not projecting New York. We're listening to the governors. He wanted them, he needed them, and we gave him thousands of beds in Javits Center. We brought the ship. Then the ship, we had it converted to a COVID-19. And that was a big deal, by the way, because of ventilation and all the things we had to do, but we did. And fortunately for him and for us, all of us, they haven't used either one very much because the numbers have gone down significantly. But it was...
So the president keeps dismissing the use of the Javits Center and the comfort for patients. While there are fewer patients than had been anticipated, there are over 800 patients at the Javits Center. At least 2 died this week. And so to suggest that it is not in use is false.
And he will, I think, tell you a story that we had more than enough. And I said, well, we're supposed to build one more. I called him. I said, if we don't have to build this hospital, it was an additional anywhere from 500 to 1,000 beds. If you don't need it, would it be possible that we don't build it? Would like to build it someplace else or not build it at all and save money, which is okay for government too. Use it someplace else. And he called me back the next day and he said, sir, we don't need it. I said, that's great that you say that. I appreciate it. And he didn't need it, but we were ready to go. We took good care.
A little thing that is good to note, very often when the president quotes someone and uses the word sir, that is often an indication that he is making the story up. It's something that we have documented at NowThis.
To 10. I don't like to count on them before they're up, but we'll have anywhere from 9 to 10 platforms with a tremendous testing capability. And people can go, and especially with phase 1. Now, at the same time, just like with ventilators, we're building now the best ventilators. Just like with ventilators, our testing is getting better and better. I took the first test. The first test was not pleasant. This was not a pleasant thing. I said, you got to be kidding to the doctor. You got to be kidding. Up your nose, and then we hang a right, and it goes down here. And then we'll wiggle it around here under your eye. And then we'll pull it out, and we'll say, I said, no, there's no way that can happen. Is that the way it goes? You sure? This was a very unpleasant test. And then I was tested a few weeks later with the new test that just came out, the Abbott, where they just touch your nose, basically, and they put it in a machine, and literally a few minutes later, they tell you if you're fine. And I was lucky in both cases, because I've seen the damage that this does to people. But we have great tests. They've really gotten better and better and better as we go along. But we have a tremendous laboratory capability all over the country. And for some reason, the governors, they're not, a lot of them are, but some of the governors like to complain and they're not using it. We have
the president keeps attempting to try to shift blame for the testing to the governors. The problem is that we need a nationwide system of testing. This has been what has been effective in other countries. Governors have been saying that they cannot on their own do what is necessary. Governor Cuomo explained this week, I can't do an international supply chain. Governor Pritzker of Illinois said we've gotten very little help from the federal government. I've given up on any promises that have been made. I hope something will get delivered from the federal government, but I don't expect it anymore. Governor Phil Murphy has explained of New Jersey that, quote, no state has the resources they need to test at the scale that they need to test. Now, what we are starting to see and began to see yesterday was the beginnings of a nationwide plan for testing. I want to highlight that South Korea, which had its first case of COVID-19 on the same day as the United States, that's January 20th, had a nationwide system for testing in place within 2 weeks. It is now late April, and we are beginning to get testing in place. And as I mentioned earlier, we actually have dropped off in the past few days. After a peak on April 4th, the U.S. has been testing fewer than 150,000 people per week. Roughly 1% of the population has been tested to date.
How did President Trump do? Oh, he did terribly. Let's see. He did terribly. Oh, but we just got him the ventilators that they didn't have that they should have had. We just got them hospital beds by the thousands. We just got them testing that they don't even know how to use.
If they don't know how to use the testing, it is your fault, Mr. President. If the governors each figuring it out on their own, then that is the problem. In terms of ventilators, is still, as of earlier this week, New York was still 14,000 ventilators short of what New York felt was needed. New Jersey was more than 5,000 short. Pennsylvania was over 1,000 short. Louisiana was over 1,000 short. And so it is not true when the president says that everyone has the ventilators that they need. We have been covering the instances of patients in hospitals where the doctors have had to decide which patient would get the ventilator and which would not because of their shortage.
Of our sweeping public health response. We have had a sweeping response. And speaking to the leaders of other countries this morning, they said, this is incredible the way you've done this so quickly. You know, we're only talking about a few weeks since everybody knew this was such a big problem. And the rest of the world is watching, and they respect what we've done, because I don't think anybody else, I know nobody else could have done what we've done. And we started with garbage. As our expert said yesterday, America's testing capability and capacity is fully.
The president is continuing to call the Obama garbage. Themselves.
What a great job we've done in this country. I told him the same thing. He said, what a great job we've done here in this country. So I appreciated that. He had a great, by the way, he had a great victory, and we're very happy about that from the standpoint of our country, working very well with them. South Korea. As we approach, and the approach that we use, but as we approach, hopefully the...
and he just mentioned South Korea. South Korea is, please excuse the fluffy cat over my shoulder. South Korea is an important example because the U.S. and South Korea both had their first cases of the coronavirus on January 20th. So again, when the president says it's only been a few weeks since everybody knew about this, that is manifestly false. South Korea put widespread testing in place within 2 weeks. We are still struggling to get widespread testing in place. South Korea has had only 232 deaths. Only 232 deaths compared to over 38,000 deaths in the U.S. Now, the U.S. has a larger population, so we should expect the U.S. to have roughly 6 times the deaths of South Korea if the two countries responded equally well. However, we have 165 times the deaths of South Korea.
Any country in the world, better than any country has ever had. We had the highest stock market in history by far, and I'm honored by the fact that it has started to go up very substantially. That's because the market is smart. The market is actually brilliant. I've seen it. And they're viewing it like we've done a good job. They view it that way. Because if you would have told me that we're at 24,000 or beyond, and the highest we were ever was, we never hit 30. We were getting close to 30. So let's say around 29,000, we're at 24. We were heading down. I would start to say, oh, wow, we may be heading into territory where I started. I didn't like that. Now we're way up. But if you would have said we've gone through, not caused by our country or our people or not caused by certainly anybody within our country, but if you would have said that after going through this horrible, that we'd have a stock market that's much, much higher than when I started, much higher than where I started. I think we have tremendous momentum. We have a big election coming up, but I think we have tremendous data and very hard evidence, not partisan agendas or coordinated political talking points. Mike Pence, who's a phenomenal guy, is making the commencement address right now at the Air Force Academy, where they're being very politically correct. Everyone's standing not 6 feet, but 10 feet apart, okay? And it's very different. I made that speech last year. I'm going to West Point. I think they're changing the date to June 13th because of what's going on in New York. They're moving it to June 13th, West Point. So I'm doing that commencement speech, and they're going to have, sad, but it's a big start. They're going to have the cadets. They may not have the parents, but they're going to have the cadets. The parents are so proud of them. I know at the Air Force Academy, where Mike is speaking right now, they don't have the parents. They have the cadets. They're very, very widespread. And you talk about social distancing. I mean, they are really spread. I looked at it. They're using 10 feet. So he's doing that. But they're having it. It's very important to have it. And that's a great thing. That's a great thing. That's a big start. So he's there right now. And I will tell you, he's a gentleman, Mike Pence, a real gentleman. And the Democrat senators requested a phone call with him yesterday, and I think they had, for the most part, all of them on, like approximately 47. I heard it was just about all of them, whatever it might be. I don't want to be wrong by 1 or 2 or 10 and have the press say, he lied, that he told a lie. Terrible, terrible. Whatever it was, but they have 47, and I guess most of them were on. I heard they were so rude. I used the term today. I said rude and nasty, but I heard they were so rude. No matter what he said, which was all very positive in terms of winning this battle against the invisible enemy, no matter what he said, they were fresh, they were nasty, and it was, I heard, just a terrible thing.
The president is attacking the Democratic senators, whom he calls the Democrat senators, and he's accusing them of being too partisan and, quote, nasty. 2 hours ago, President Trump was tweeting about Sleepy Joe. He yesterday was tweeting about crazy Nancy Pelosi. He also yesterday urged gun enthusiasts in Virginia to put the Democratic governor under siege. The president has been overtly partisan at every step of this process.
They had us, but we got them done at numbers that nobody would have believed. And we did use our act, our production act, and we used it, but we didn't use it, we didn't need it like a hammer. All we had to do, for the most part, we used it actually in a number of cases, but for the most part, all we had to do is talk about it.
The president is spinning his baffling decision not to engage the Defense Production Act, which the New York Times has reported he has used hundreds of thousands of times to get military assets that he felt that he needed, but that he did not use to direct manufacturing companies to produce ventilators and gowns in a timely fashion. And as a result, hospitals across the country are suffering massive shortages because of the president's delay.
You know that. I mean, I even read a story where Mark Meadows, this tough guy, he was crying. He was crying. This was a Maggie Haberman. You know, she won a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of Russia, but she was wrong in Russia. So was everyone else. They should all give back their Pulitzer Prizes. In fact, it turned out that the crime was committed by the other side.
This is not true. The president is lying about the Russia situation, as the Mueller report concluded, confirming the conclusions of the international community. Russia did indeed interfere in the U.S. presidential election to benefit Donald Trump and to hurt Hillary Clinton. The Trump campaign knew that this was happening and welcomed the help of a hostile foreign power to influence the U.S. election.
As being a bad reporter, what happened is she came out and said Mark Meadows was crying, and they made it sound, I said, Mark, and it's okay if he did, I wouldn't, look. But I think he was crying probably really for the wrong reason. They had it down. But he's not a crier. And if he was, I've known criers. I could tell you people that that are very famous, they cry. And that's okay, too. But it was a nasty story in so many ways. It was fake news. And she only did it because we exposed her for being a terrible, dishonest reporter.
So the president is using this briefing to attack reporters, attack Democratic senators. This is supposedly a coronavirus task force briefing. The president is not talking about the coronavirus. The president is instead going on about the Russia investigation, insulting the New York Times, insulting Democratic senators. I'm going to take this moment to read you some actual facts. So the number of global cases of the coronavirus is up to nearly 2.3 million as of today. The number of cases in the U.S. is over 715,000. There have been roughly 18,000 new cases since yesterday. The president earlier falsely claimed that the U.S. is having fewer deaths per capita than most other nations. We are having more deaths per capita than Iran, Germany, Austria, South Korea, China, Australia, or Japan, and possibly many others.
And I mean mandated to use a name. If there's a source, use a name. Say that Kayleigh McEnany said, or somebody. And you'd find out that the, number one, the source wouldn't say it. The sources don't exist. I don't believe the sources exist.
So the president is claiming that when news outlets, respected news outlets, use unnamed sources, that means the sources don't exist. This is a president, by the way, who frequently uses the phrase "people are saying" to give credence to false conspiracy theories and ideas that no one is saying other than he himself.
The talk of other nations, the leaders of other nations are calling us for help. They're calling us for equipment. They're calling us for testing capacities. Now, the
president is suggesting that the U.S. is doing better than other nations in various respects. This is simply not true. The U.S. lags behind most other nations in testing. The U.S. has more cases of coronavirus than any other country, and more deaths per capita than many countries.
Far we've come, and more importantly, where we're going from this point, because honestly, it's quite amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As states and as counties and as cities, I know you all are watching carefully. The numbers have shifted over the last few days. What happens when when states change the reporting from confirmed to probable? So now all probable cases are included. They had to add them back in. Even though the cases may have been from March, they were added over 14th, 15th, and 16th of April, and states may continue to be adding them. Eventually, we're hoping that those get accounted for on the day when the presumptive cases or the probable cases were counted, but right now they're added in one fell swoop. So this is New York and New Jersey, and I think we all know how difficult and what a difficult time both New York and New Jersey have had. I call your attention to the axis. It goes up to 250,000 cases, so you can get a frame of how we're talking about some of the other metro areas. Next slide. These are the 25 metro areas, the top 25 metro areas, and you can only see the New York metro area in this slide. Again, the axis goes up to about 300,000. It includes the New Jersey part of the metro area as well as part of southern Connecticut. Next slide. But if I take New York out, and the reason I wanted to do that, now the axis is 1/10 of the previous axis. So that previous axis, the previous slide, 300,000. This slide, 30,000. So that will give you a frame of reference for some of these other metros. The reason I wanted to show you this is cumulative cases, and we are still tracking very closely the issues in Chicago and Boston. But on this slide, I hope you can see the yellow line. That is Detroit. And Detroit and this mayor of Detroit has really done an extraordinary job, and the people of Detroit have done an extraordinary job with their social distancing. The other line I want to call your attention to is the line here. This is New Orleans. And I think, frankly, I was concerned about New Orleans because they had a lot of pre-existing comorbidities. They have 2 or 3 major hospitals, but cover a very large area, a geographic area. And that other blue line that you can see that's down right here, that's the Seattle line. And you can see that their response, because of the nursing home alert, they were one of the first states and the first metro areas to really move to social distancing. And so they've really never had a peak like many of the other metros. Next slide. Then I just want to take you through some of these new case graphics. That was cumulative cases. This is daily cases. And obviously there's a lot of variability in reporting, but you get a sense over time when you look at daily cases. So New Orleans is on panel on your left and Baton Rouge on your right. But you can see clearly New Orleans about a month ago, very low levels, probably less than 50 cases, large peak and spike around the beginning of April, and they have come down, and they have down to very few cases. Again, I showed you before how both their syndromic cases have come down as well as their actual number of cases. Next slide. This is Seattle. So you can see they had a much lower peak. And this is when we talk about flattening the curve. This is what flattening the curve looks like. It becomes a longer, slower decline, but it never gets very high and then goes back down. Next slide. And then this is Detroit. And we always look at the metros as a consolidated. So this is both Wayne and Oakland in Michigan. And we really want to thank the mayor for the incredible job that they have done to really ensure that everyone is receiving the adequate health care and testing. And they've done quite a good job with testing in Michigan. But all of these states, Louisiana and New York, have tested 30,000 per million inhabitants. Those are some of our highest numbers across the board. And next slide. And so the president talked about the case fatality rates, and we've lost a lot of Americans to this disease, and we pray and hope for each one of them that are in the hospitals and the excellent care. What this graph illustrates is the amazing work of the American people to really adhere to social distancing. This was nothing we had ever attempted to do as a nation, and the world hadn't attempted to do. But they were able to decrease the number of cases so that in general, most of the metro areas never had an issue of complete crisis care of all of their hospitals in a region. And so you can see our case fatality rate is about half to a third of many of the other countries.
Excuse me, does anybody really believe this number?
I put China on there so you could see how basically unrealistic this could be. when highly developed healthcare delivery systems of the United Kingdom and France and Belgium and Italy and Spain with extraordinary doctors and nurses and equipment have case fatality rates in the 20s up to 45, and Belgium is extraordinarily competent healthcare delivery system, and then China at 0.33. You realize that these numbers, even then this includes the doubled number out of Wuhan. And so I want it really to put it in perspective, but I wanted you also to see how great the care has been for every American that has been hospitalized.
So these are somewhat cherry-picked numbers. This graph has been set up to make it look as though the U.S. is near the bottom in terms of deaths per capita because there are 6 countries ahead. But it omits countries like Iran, Germany, Austria, South Korea, Australia, and Japan. And the president now is... what's he doing?
This is why the reporting is so important. And I think you remember almost 6 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, I was telling you what Italy was showing to us and what France was telling to us and the warnings that they gave to us and said, be very careful. There's an extraordinary high mortality among people with pre-existing conditions. And we used their information to bring that to the American people. That alert before we even had significant cases, came from our European colleagues on the front line. And that's why we keep coming back to how important in a pandemic and a new disease, it's really critical to have that level of transparency because it changes how we work as a nation. It allowed us on over March 15th to make an alert out there about vulnerable individuals and the need to protect them, and my call out to millennials to really protect their parents, protect their grandparents, and get that information out to everyone, that there were pre-existing conditions that put people at greater risk. That information came from our European colleagues who were in the midst of their battle themselves. And so there is never an excuse to not share information. When you are the first country to have an outbreak, you really have a moral obligation to the world to not only talk about it, but provide that information that's critical to the rest of the world to really respond to this credibly. And I really want to thank our European colleagues who worked so hard to get us that information, even in the midst of their own tragedies. And I think that really shows how important transparency is. And we go to the next slide. We can show you this really encouraging and great news. So we know that fatalities will continue to lag because people are in hospitals still, and some are still in intensive care units. But these COVID-like illnesses, this is our hospitalizations that are related to flu per 100,000 Americans. This is this year's flu season, and you can see our COVID-like illnesses, and this is all of them, probable and confirmed cases. Our hospitalizations are declining. Now, I showed you metros that have made tremendous progress. And we've been up here many times talking about it being 6, 10, 15 additional cities. And now we're really just focused on Chicago and Boston and Massachusetts, and really some issues that Providence is starting to improve now, so their relationship to the 2 large outbreak cities. But this is really reassuring to us of the progress we're making across the country against this disease. And I just really want to conclude by thanking again the American people for making these type of graphics possible. Thank the data team who puts these together for me. So they are working to about 3:30 every morning to make sure that we have the most up-to-date information. That's the data that goes to our supply chain individuals to ensure that every hospital in every state and every community has what they need based on data, and to make sure that we're serving the needs of the American people as effectively as possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Fantastic job. Is it yours? Thank you very much. The fact is that we've been learning a lot from Deborah and Tony and so many of the professionals, the director. PEPFAR, we're spending the United States, for that help to the best of my knowledge, mostly in Africa, $6 billion a year. And that's on AIDS. What we've done for AIDS in Africa is unbelievable. We spend $6 billion a year. That's been going on for a long time. Nobody knows that. You've never heard that.
The president tends to think that if he doesn't know something, nobody knows it. He's pretending that the PEPFAR program is unknown. Those who follow global health are very well aware of the PEPFAR program, which began in large part because of Tony Fauci under the George W. Bush administration and was expanded under the Obama administration.
Cortisone, and something that was very close to her heart. So it's, it's something that I think people should start hearing. The World Health Organization, we're just finding more and more problems, and we spend this money really well. There are other ways we can spend the $500 million. That's $500 million. This is $6 billion. But we can find other ways to spend it where people are going to be helped, we think, in a much greater way. We're doing some research on certain people that take a lot of credit for what they do. And NIH is giving away a lot of money. We give away for many years, they give away a lot of money. And some people complain and some people don't. Some people are extremely happy. So we're looking into that also. They're giving away approximately, as I understand it, recently more than $32 billion a year. $32 billion. And so we've been looking at that for a while, and we're going to be having some statements to be made about that. $32 billion a year. It's a lot of money, and we want to make sure it's being spent wisely, and we've been doing that, by the way, and we'll have some statements on that.
So the president always tends to imply that it's a bad idea to be spending money overseas. We are now seeing the cost of not spending it. He did not renew funding for CDC pandemic international monitoring, which led to 39 CDC international locations being closed down, including in China. So this could have been, that is money that could have been well spent to help prevent the situation that we're currently in.
It was given some time ago, and we're looking at that very closely. Chief of Staff has that pretty much under control, but it's money that, too bad it got spent there. But that was spent, what year was that, Mark? It was 4 or 5 years ago.
Over the last 6 years.
6 years ago, approximately. So we're looking at that, and that's the lab that people are talking about. All right, so we're looking at a lot of things. There's tremendous waste in our government. We found it in many different ways and in many different forms. And
the president likes to highlight what he believes is waste in the government. For instance, he said that when he fired the Global Health Security Unit from the National Security Council, that was the team of people that President Obama had put together to be on the lookout for international pandemics. He suggested that it was a smart cost-cutting measure to get rid of that team.
So late, long after I said we have to close off our country. They were actually against our closing off our country to China. When I did that in January, they were against that. They didn't like the idea of closing off our country. They said it was a bad thing to do, actually.
This is not true. President Trump did not have objections to placing travel restrictions on China. He did not actually do it in January, as he claims. The restrictions went into effect in February, and they were not especially strong restrictions. U.S. citizens continued to come and go from China. Roughly 420,000 people arrived in the U.S. from China between January and even following his travel restrictions.
Back, and I expect that we're going to be bigger, better, and stronger than ever before. I will take a few questions. Jeff?
Mr. President, you've mentioned, and the doctor had mentioned China a few times today, that clearly suggesting that the data has not been good. And
well, you tell me, do you think that data is good when you see that? Do you think that's correct, okay? Do you honestly believe that's correct?
Dramatic contrast. So my question for
dramatic?
you,
Yeah, that's dramatic.
So my question for you, sir, is
why didn't the press, why didn't you people figure that out though? Why do we have to put up a chart? The number is impossible. It's an impossible number to hit. But why haven't you come up and said that?
The president is now attacking China, suggesting that their numbers are not accurate. Earlier this year, he praised China for their transparency, tweeting, China has been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. The United States greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency.
I'm going to say that every country has a responsibility to tell the rest of the world what's going on. You've talked repeatedly about how this could have been stopped in the past. I know you don't want to telegraph what you would do, but do you think that there should be some consequences if in the end, China was responsible for all of this?
Well, if they were knowingly responsible, certainly. If it was a mistake is a mistake. But if they were knowingly responsible, yeah, then there should be consequences. You're talking about, potentially lives like nobody's seen since 1917. And, the other thing, had we not done what we did in terms of closing, because there is that concept of let's let it ride. But at some point, I'm going to have to, I don't want to embarrass countries that I like and leaders that I like, but you have to see some of these numbers. In my opinion, so we're talking about maybe 60,000 or so. That's a lot of people, but that's 100,000 was the minimum we thought that we could get to, and we will be lower than that number, anywhere from 100 to 220,000 people. But I really believe it could have been millions of people had we not done what we did. We made a lot of good decisions, but one of those things. Go ahead.
New analysis that has been released suggests that if the president had advocated for stronger social distancing measures 2 weeks earlier, roughly 90% of the deaths could have been avoided.
You're in charge of everything, yet the American people don't understand why you're unwilling to use the awesome powers of your presidency to make American companies manufacture the PPE and also the testing equipment that you need to implement your recommendations.
No, but who are you with?
I'm with TMN. Recommendations for
TMN. What is
Talk
TMN?
Media News.
What?
My name is Doug Christian with Talk Media News. Yes.
Talk Media News.
Yeah. And
Go ahead. Keep reading your question.
the thing is how to make companies build these testing equipment so that you can do what you want.
Well, we're doing that right
recommended.
now. We're doing it right now with ventilators. We have General Motors. We have General Electric. We have 11 different companies.
Well, but the president did not actually engage the Defense Production Act until much later than governors across the nation were asking him to. And in fact, GM began producing ventilators on their own without an official order being placed from the U.S. government. GM warns that it will not be able to complete its current production order until August, which is obviously much too late for much of the nation.
Worse than any Democrat. Go ahead.
But he said that he was livid, actually.
Of course he said that. Because he's a Democrat, okay? Angus King is not an independent. He uses that term for whatever reason. It's a waste of time.
But he's not a very emotive type
Oh,
of
yes,
senator.
he is. You haven't seen him. Okay, you haven't seen him. No. Angus King is a Democrat, and that was totally staged. I heard that, and it was totally staged. Just like you read the question, he read his question. Yeah, please, in the back.
Mr. President, I want to ask you about one of your retweets.
Which one?
The one you retweeted from Paul Sperry. Let's see if authorities enforce the social distancing orders for mosque during Ramadan like they did churches during Easter. I'm wondering...
Yeah, no, I would like to see that. And, I just spoke with leaders and people that love mosques. They love mosques. And I'm all in favor of that. But I would say that there could be a difference, and we'll have to see what will happen. Because I've seen a great disparity in this country. I've seen a great disparity. I mean, I've seen a very strong anti-Israel bent in Congress with Democrats. It was unthinkable 7 or 8 or 10 years ago, and now they're into a whole different thing between Omar and AOC. I say AOC plus 3, add them on. You have, I mean, the things that they say about Israel are so bad. And I can't believe it. Now, just a minute. So I would be interested to see that because they go after Christian churches, but they don't tend to go after mosques. And
The president is making a bizarre and baseless claim that governments enforce rules on churches more stringently than on mosques. This is not true, but what we have seen is that a wide number of churches across the country insisted on holding services, and people who went to those services, in fact, became sick.
And it matters not what your faith is, but our politicians seem to treat different faiths very differently. And they seem to think, and I don't know what happened with our country, but the Christian faith is treated much differently than it was. And I think it's treated very unfairly. Yes, please, go ahead in the back.
The suggestion that Christians are discriminated against and do not have the same rights that Muslims in this country have is blatantly false. This is a conspiracy theory that is spread by news outlets, conspiracy theories, theorists such as Paul Sperry, whom the president retweeted. Paul Sperry is the author of the book Muslim Mafia. Remember, this is the president who threatened to ban all Muslims from entering the country, including, I suppose, American citizens, and that was part of his campaign promise as president. We have seen that in 2018 there was a 74% increase in some states of Islamophobic attacks. It is hard to imagine that that exists in isolation from the president's repeated anti-Muslim rhetoric. And Tatiana, or Ian, if you're able to flag, we have a video about the history of the president's anti-Muslim rhetoric. We should post that in the comments. There has been an increase from 2016 to 2017 to 2018, each year an increase in new hate crimes targeting Muslims in the U.S.
Please, go ahead.
Dr. Burks, if I may, you again praised the American people for doing their bit over the past few weeks. But what goes through your mind when you see photographs of crowded beaches in Florida? Is that a concern for when we start seeing some of these restrictions being lifted?
Well, as I described, we go metro by metro, county by county, and so I'd have to link that with a specific county and look at their case rates. I believe the governor and the public health system that Florida has, they have some of the best county public health individuals I have ever had to deal with. They are amazing because I had to work with them under HIV/AIDS. So if the county health directors believe that that's appropriate for their county, then I'm not going to second judge an individual's approach to this, because I can't see into every single county and load the low rates. I can just see there's no cases. So I don't know if that's a county with very small cases or not, but I think their county health official would know.
And many of the counties, as you know, are really free of this horrible enemy. So we're opening up. You'll be seeing a lot of this country start to open up fairly quickly. Yes, please.
That was a question about how states that have kept their beaches open have been impacted. I want to highlight that Florida now has over 25,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 and has lost over 741 Floridians. As a state with a high number of senior citizens, there is a particularly high risk, and yet Governor DeSantis of Florida insisted on keeping beaches open when local authorities urged having them closed.
Take your guns away if they want to violate your Second Amendment. When you look at, look, I'm getting along very nicely with the governor of Michigan, but she has things: don't buy paint, don't buy roses, she's got all these crazy things. I really believe somebody sitting in their boat in a lake should be okay. They shouldn't arrest people. Some of them are being unreasonable. I really believe that. They're being unreasonable. But I think Virginia's a great case, though, because they're using this. They're trying to take your guns away in Virginia.
This is simply not true. They are not trying to take your guns away in Virginia, and it is not related to the coronavirus. Virginia passed several common sense gun reforms this week, which the governor signed into law. They included universal background checks, not a radical idea. 92% of Americans support this, including a majority of gun owners. Red flag laws, which again the majority of Americans support. A limit on purchases so that you can't buy more than one handgun a month, not a radical idea. A fine for parents who leave their guns out where their kids can get at them. And a requirement that if your gun is stolen, you have to tell the police. This is simply not true to say that this is taking guns away from law-abiding Virginians.
I spoke to the governors, and I could have gotten them to do, if I wanted to do what would have been perhaps politically correct, but they've been doing incredibly anyway. And as one of them said, everybody's doing exactly the same. In fact, our record is better than states where they're under a mandate or, where they've agreed to do certain things. Now, we have some great states out there. We have incredible people in our country. And for the most part, that it's a strong statement, but I understand where it's coming from. And I think one of the greats would be one of the really important places that people really have to start looking at is what's going on in Virginia, because that's a mess with really a governor that's under siege anyway. Yeah, please.
The governor of Virginia also, by the way, is a doctor. And President Trump just now is suggesting that states with looser restrictions are doing better than states with tighter restrictions. I want to point out that while states with very large cities have a higher number of cases, the rate of growth is higher in many rural states. There has been in Oklahoma a 53% increase in the last week, a 60% increase in Arkansas, a 74% increase in Nebraska, an 82% increase in Iowa, and a 205% increase in South Dakota.
They're fighting it. They're trying to take that Second Amendment right, that Second Amendment right away.
And again, Virginia is not taking the Second Amendment away. I just told you what the gun reforms were. They have broad bipartisan support, and they are not radical, nor do they impose an undue burden upon law-abiding Virginians.
And if you notice, at the beginning of this pandemic, there were more guns sold, I think, than at almost any time in history. So it's obviously a big issue. And then you have them working and signing documents trying to take your Second Amendment away, essentially. So I do think it's an appropriate time to bring it up. Go ahead.
It is not true to say that there were more guns sold at the beginning of this than at any other time in history, but it is true to say that March was the most gun sales that America had since March of 2012. President Trump and Republicans have been advocates of making gun stores be considered essential services. There are at present more gun stores offering curbside sales than there are drive-through testing locations.
Vladimir Putin, we worked out a deal on oil. That was a very important deal to them and to us and to Saudi Arabia. It was in a deadlock. You know it. You covered it very well. Actually, Wall Street Journal covered that very well. I worked with Putin and with the king on that, and President Putin was a total gentleman, and it was very important to get that done, and the king was great.
It is really striking to hear the nonstop praise that President Trump has for Putin. Bear in mind the insults that he has waged in this very press conference at Democratic governors and senators. He is calling President Putin, whom we know for a fact interfered in the U.S. election in 2016, a fine gentleman.
The world, and they don't understand how life works. If I wasn't elected, you would right now, maybe the war would be over, hopefully with a victory. But if you remember when I first came in, we didn't have ammunition. Not a good way to fight a war.
This is a false claim that President Trump has repeatedly made. It is absolutely false to say that we are out, that the U.S. did not have ammunition. Washington Post has given that claim 3 Pinocchios on many occasions.
Essentially, in some form, be over. It would be raging with North Korea if I weren't president. And we're doing just fine with North Korea, just fine. Let's see how it all ends up. In the meantime, they said, oh, Trump's given up. And then they said, oh, really, what's he given up? And they said, I don't know. Then they said, he met. Oh, I met. No, I have a good relationship with Kim Jong-un. That's not a bad thing to have a good relationship. Obama wanted a relationship. He wouldn't meet with Obama. Wouldn't meet with him.
This is simply not true. that President Obama wanted to meet with Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un would not. North Korea has wanted a meeting with the U.S. president for a long time. An in-person meeting between the two was, in fact, a large concession, which the U.S. got nothing in return for.
China's been very good on the border. In fact, right now, the border is stone cold closed between China and North Korea. Our relationship with China was good until they did this. Once we found out about this, look, we just made a trade deal where China's going to have to buy $250 billion a year in our product, $50 billion from the farmers, $40 to $50 billion from the farmers. The relationship was good when we were signing that, but then all of a sudden you hear about this. So it's a big difference. You know, the question was asked, would you be angry at China? Well, the answer might very well be a very resounding yes, but it depends. Was it a mistake that got out of control, or was it done deliberately? Okay.
The president seems to be fueling a conspiracy theory that this disease was manufactured. Medical experts say that the evidence suggests absolutely that it is not the case. Dr. Fauci yesterday confirmed that the medical evidence is that this is something that occurred naturally, but the president has been looking for different people to blame and has been feeding into conspiracy theories.
First week, I said, tell me about Iran. Sir, we have 18 points of confliction, meaning Yemen, Syria, all Iraq. They're going into Iraq all over the place. They're a much different nation right now. I stopped that horrible deal, and they want to talk, except that Kerry violated the Logan Act.
So the president is again suggesting that the Iran deal was a bad deal. According to virtually all diplomatic experts, the Iran deal was working. It was preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Iran is now closer to developing a nuclear weapon than before the deal, and the U.S. has gained nothing.
Bills, and it's not that small a room. And I say he violated the Logan Act. I think it was a major violation. I think we would have had a deal if it wasn't for John Kerry. But he doesn't want to be, number one, embarrassed. Number two, he said, let's wait till after the election. Maybe Sleepy Joe Biden's going to win. And if Sleepy Joe Biden wins, you'll own the United States. And China will own the United States. China's paid us, you know, from the Wall Street Journal, hundreds of billions of dollars. Is that right? Tariffs. And
okay, the president repeatedly says that China is paying us for the tariffs on Chinese goods. I don't know if he is lying or if he is wildly ignorant of basic economic facts. I suppose it can be both, but that is not how tariffs work. Tariffs are not paid by the other country. Tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the U.S. are paid by the U.S. importer. So we have not been getting money from China from the tariffs that he imposed on Chinese goods.
2 months, we had by far, and China was supposed to catch us. You know better than anybody, Wall Street Journal. For years I've heard, by 2019, China will catch us. There's only one problem. Trump got elected in 2016. That was a big difference. And we were going leaps and bounds above China. And before the problem with the plague, right? China was having the worst year they've had in 67 years. That was before the plague. Now they're getting really hurt, and so is everybody getting hurt. I don't want them to get hurt, but they're all getting hurt. Everybody's getting hurt. It's a horrible thing that's happened. But we had the greatest economy in the world by far. China isn't even close. Go back 2 months. And we're going to keep it that way. But when you mention Iran, Iran is a much different country than it was. When I first came in, Iran was going to take over the entire Middle East. Right now, they just want to survive. They're having protests every week. They're loaded up with the plague, which I don't want. I've offered to help them if they want. If they need ventilators, which they do, I would send them ventilators. We have thousands of excess ventilators.
We do not have thousands of excess ventilators. As I have highlighted, New York is still roughly 14,000 ventilators short of what the governor feels that we need. New Jersey is over 5,000 ventilators short. We do not have an excess of ventilators. But it is true that these new sanctions that the U.S. has imposed on Iran have posed a problem for Iran in facing this pandemic, because countries are less willing to send medical goods to Iran for fear of running afoul of the U.S. And the Human Rights Watch has specifically called out the U.S. for contributing to the deadly situation in Iran as a result of the sanctions.
They don't. They're being shamed in because the guy that gave them the sweetheart didn't want to met with them many times. He should have never met with them. And in my opinion, he's telling them, don't wait. Maybe Trump will lose, and then you can negotiate with a patsy, with a weak guy, and you'll take over between you and Russia. Nobody's been tougher on Putin. He knows it better than anybody. Nobody's been tougher on Putin than me. Look at the sanctions. Look at what I did with their pipeline going into Europe. Nobody even knew about it. I exposed it. Now everybody talks about it. I think it's a terrible thing for Germany to do. But at the same time, I have a very good relationship with Putin, and I was able to make a deal with Russia and Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus. They call it OPEC Plus. That's going to save us, Texas, North Dakota, Oklahoma, other states, energy states, going to save us hundreds.
So President Trump falsely saying that nobody has been tougher on Russia. He mentioned sanctions that were placed on Russia. The Congress essentially forced his hand to implement sanctions that he seemed reluctant to implement. He appears to have stormed off in a huff. Wow. That was an abrupt end. It appears that the president got worked up and has abruptly ended the press conference without actually really talking much about the coronavirus during this briefing. I want to just say also on the subject of nobody's been tougher on Russia, in fact, the only request that the Trump campaign had during the creation of the Republican platform at the Republican convention in 2016 was to weaken the stance of defending Ukraine against Russian aggression. And in fact, President Trump's withholding of money to Ukraine as he attempted to extort personal political favors from Ukraine definitively strengthened Russia's hand against Ukraine in its ongoing war. So that was a very odd and rather cantankerous briefing, even by President Trump's standards. I don't entirely know what to make of today's briefing, but I thank you for joining us. I am NowThis senior politics producer, Alan Piper. I had the full support from our team today, including Tatiana Baez, Kavish Harjai, Megan Hirschlein, Ian McKenna, and Jackie Padilla, and Matt McDonough. Some of the things that the president did not talk about in the briefing, he did not talk about the fact that more Americans died on Thursday from the coronavirus than in the entire Iraq war. It was the single deadliest day for the U.S. Since this began. The U.S., which comprises about little over 4% of the world's population, now accounts for more than 30% of the world's coronavirus cases and roughly 20% of the deaths. U.S. testing levels appear to have stalled at around between 145,000 to 150,000 tests per day, which is well short of the 500,000 tests that top experts believe is necessary to begin returning the country to normal. These are things that we might have expected to talk about in today's briefing. Instead, we heard attacks on the New York Times. We'd heard attacks on the governor of Virginia and the common sense gun reforms that were passed there. We heard attacks on the governor of Michigan. We heard attacks on Senator Angus King. We heard praise for Putin. We heard the Obama administration referred to as, quote, garbage. This was definitely one of his more cantankerous briefings. If there is a briefing tomorrow, we will be back to cover it. If you are celebrating Orthodox Easter tomorrow, I wish you a happy Easter. The Easter theme of life conquering death is especially meaningful at this painful moment in our world history. To everyone out there, please stay safe, take care of yourself, check in on the people that you care about, and please don't let another day go by without making sure that the people you love know how much you love them. We are at a terrible moment in our nation and our world's history.